Hi, everyone who's on the line. Welcome to Barn Week Day 2. We had a lot of great responses from Day 1 programming, so we're glad you're here. As I said earlier, introduce yourself in the chat box. You can chat with each other participants. And then if you have specific questions about the content of the presentation today, go ahead and put that in the Q&A. We are really happy to bring together barn enthusiasts from across the state for this week-long celebration. I am Jennifer Mortensen with the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. For those of you who are new to the Trust, we are Washington's statewide nonprofit advocacy organization, and we work to build a collective ethic that preserves historic places through education, collaboration, and stewardship. Education like today. We are dedicated to saving the places that matter in Washington state and building, supporting, and sustaining communities through historic preservation. For the past 13 years, the Washington Trust has been honored to support the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, which is who Michael Hauser works with, in managing the Heritage Barn Grant Program, which offers grants to historic barns and helps preserve our rural landscape. And part of that program also is the Heritage Barn Register, which Michael manages. And he's going to be kind of going over the types of barns and features that you find in the grant program and on the register as well. So if you're just tuning in today for Barn Week for the first time, you may be wondering what it's all about. This week was created through funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as mitigation for a historic barn that needed to be dismantled. So the salvaged barn materials were repurposed in other projects, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife provided funding for us to create this week of learning and celebration and fun, all centered on historic barns. So if you want to see some of the rehab projects that that material went to, tune in tomorrow. So throughout the week, we'll be hosting daily webinars like this on Zoom. You can tune in on Facebook Live and on our Washington Trust Facebook page. So we're also featuring a lot of bonus content on Facebook, including trivia with prizes, Barn of the Day features. So be sure to look us up at Preserve-Wa for extra content. And we know that you all have a lot of stories of your own to share about the barns that you own and love. So definitely tag it with hashtag Barn Week and tag us at Preserve-Wa, and we'd love to share those out as well. So without further ado, today we'll be turning the program over to our state architectural historian, Michael Hauser, for an introduction to the barns of Washington. As I mentioned, tomorrow we're going to share some really fantastic transformations and restorations from the past 13 years of the grant program, as well as show the salvage material barn. And then on Thursday, we'll wrap things up with a particularly special behind-the-scenes tour of 2 historic barns with our nationally renowned preservation expert, Harrison Goodall. So as a reminder, every day at noon here on Zoom, but you do have to register for each one individually to participate. So all the attendees are in watch mode only, so participate through the chat and the Q&A box. And then, as I said, anyone on Facebook Live can submit questions that way as well. We are recording this panel or this presentation, and we'll be posting it later. So just be aware of that. So thank you again, and let's get started. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Michael. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jennifer. It's great to see, or at least hear, or at least know you're there. Looks like we've got about 51 participants. What I wanted to do today was really, I don't really want to talk so much about the barn register program, but I want to talk about just barns and general barn styles, barn typologies, mainly from a pedestrian's perspective. So as you are traveling out across the state, looking at the rural landscape, going down those great roads, you might be able to just identify some barns out there and say, hey, that looks like a cool Gambrel style barn, probably from the 1920s. So that's our sort of goal today. And we're mainly going to talk about stuff in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, everything I'm showing you is pictures from Washington State, barns in Washington State. And like a lot of architecture, you know, things that are found in the East Coast, you know, get carried on and sort of show up in the Pacific Northwest, but at a little later date. So we're really talking about 20th century barns here in Washington State, because the first you know, building technology, at least from European building technology. It doesn't show up until the 1850s, 1870s, sometime in there. With that, let's just get right into the next slide. Here we go. Wanted to make sure everybody's on the same page about talking about terminology, just some different elements of barns that we see out there, from where the main entrance doors are the barn are important in terms of the alley doors and the hayloft. How those are presented tell us a lot about the style and the typology of the barn itself, whether it's on the front or the side, things of that nature. So these are just common sort of elements that you might see. If you're looking at it from a bird's eye view, barns have additions to them, right? And additions might be original to the building, or little wings to them, or they might be later additions. And so when we're looking at barns from this bird's eye perspective, it depends on where the addition is at. So if it's off the back and your entranceway is off the front, then it's called a wing. If it's turned 90 degrees, it's an L versus parallel to that front door. It would be called a lean-to. I know that's confusing, but it'll be crystal clear when we start to see some of these design elements. There are many different types of forms and types out there when you look at barns, but most of the terminology that we see, or even barn books out there, are really very East Coast centric or Midwest centric. There are lots of different ways that you can classify barns out there. There's the use and the purpose of the barn. There's the shape and the plan. There's different types of framing system. Here in Washington State, we decided to go with the roof form as a classification method, basically because we're doing this pedestrian survey from the street. These are all private property. It's hard to get into them, and so we wanted to be able to quickly kind of analyze a barn and classify it to know, hey, this is an unusual example. This is a good example. This is the best example, that sort of thing. So we're looking at roof form, and there are lots of different roof forms out there and some subcategories of roof forms. And you'll notice them when you start to see them. So the gable form is really one of the earliest barn forms that you might find out there, also called an English barn or Yankee barn. In the earliest examples, the entranceway is often on the gable end of the building versus the eave end, or the building versus the gable end. Since we're talking about Washington State and things are later, sometimes they tend to be on the eave end. Here's one with an attached lean-to, right? Not an L or a wing, that's an attached lean-to. Here's a couple other examples. And notice that our barns range in size from anywhere from, a very large horse barn, maybe housing, 20 or 30 horses, to could be a small little barn just for almost a carriage house, just housing a couple of horses. So that's the gable shape. There's also one that's got a salt box shape to it. And it's got this integrated lean-to right off the front. So the entranceway mainly is on that front gable side, and then it's got this attached lean-to, which is original to the structure. I thought this one up in Westport is kind of an interesting example. Here it is down in Stewart Island. It's the same barn. It was basically a planned barn from the U.S. Coast Guard. And so you'll find these as a horse stable for the Coast Guard for a lighthouse up on Stewart Island. There's one up in Westport for their lighthouse. That one, the bottom open porch area has been enclosed. So the salt box form gets its name from the salt box. So if you were out in a western town or back east, and you went into a little mercantile store, they had boxes where you could come and open up big grain bins and things like that. And the salt box had that kind of shape to it, where the integrated lean-to was the door basically to open up. So that's where that roof form comes into play. There are things that, like the one down in St. John's, that it has a bank in the front of it. So you might say, well, hey, wait a minute, Michael, this is a bank barn. So it is a bank barn, but it's also a salt box form of the barn itself. There's something called a Dutch barn. We have a a lot of these around in Washington State. And the difference between a gable barn and this one is where the gable is just a massive structure covering up fully the full second story or the hayloft. Some of those others that we looked at with the gable barn just covers up the top of the second story of the hayloft. This one goes all the way down to the first floor, and some of them even come down lower than 6 feet. I could almost touch the roof really from the side elevation. So these are pretty easy to spot. In fact, this barn in Little Rock that we're looking up here is the one that got dismantled due to this program that we were talking about, that Jay mentioned earlier. Some other pictures of gable barns around the state. And oddly enough, I haven't really found any particular typology in one location of the state than others. There were certainly itinerant builders, and you'll find some levels of barns in certain valleys where there's lots of the same sort of designs, but you can find a Dutch barn, just as easy down by the coast versus over in Spokane. They're really all over the place. So that hasn't played out in the state, surprisingly. There's also one that's called a broken gable. So it's got these integrated lean-tos on either side of the main entrance way. Some great examples across the state as well. And that angle is different all over the place. There's no standard sort of angle. It really depends on how big the barn is through that element. There's also ones which we call a gable on hip. So remember, a gable roof is a triangle, right? And the hip looks more like a pyramidal shape. And so there are gables that rest on hips. These are very, a little bit more unusual, only a handful of these that I know of in the state, but some pretty cool examples, to say the least. Some of the other more common examples may only have a hip that goes around 3 sides instead of the full 4 sides, but there definitely are examples that you can find out there. So a gable on hip. This barn up in Walla Walla is one of the massive barns that we have in the state. It's 100 feet long. So that's always a cool one to look at. Or a typical barn that everybody might think about is a barn that's got a gambrel roof. And this is one that, unlike the broken gable that had a little cant out on the end, this one has a cant in the going in towards the front, right? In towards the middle. So it's got 4 sides to it. What makes this an English gambrel is that the detail on the eave line, so you'll notice that how smooth the eave line is. I'm going to show you another sort of subtype that's got an extra little detail on it called a Dutch gambrel. But these gambrels, English gambrels, have lots of different pitches on them as well, really depending on how wide and how big that barn might be. So the one down in Ferndale barely looks like an English gambrel, but you can see that break in the roof line that gives it that extra little side push there. The reason for these roofs are basically, the idea is to get more storage up in the hayloft. So for tall guys like myself, if it was a house, which you can find gambrel roofs on a house, you could get more headroom, more height, and in a barn, you could get more storage space. So that's really where that design comes from. Some of these barns have stylistic details to them that you might see. So this great example in Ellensburg has these little cornice returns on the eave line where the roof comes back, and sort of my fingers would be the cornice return in and of itself, returning, because that gives it a little colonial sort of feel. Some of them also have little knee braces that have some craftsman style elements to them. So that'll give you a dating method as well. Other examples that you might see out there. Here's a sub-example of that gambrel roof called a Dutch gambrel, and notice it has this extra little flare at the eave line, making it look like a Dutch roof. And the reason for the flare is really to keep the building protected from the rain. So they thought it was a better idea just to give that extra little cant, get the water out and away from the side of the building. So that's why that comes into play on these buildings. And these structures can really date from anywhere from, around 1910 all the way up into the 1950s. So you'll find Dutch gambrels spanning that full time frame. Other examples, notice the size different variation, as well as the cladding out there, right? Here's an early example of a corrugated metal applied to original horizontal. And you have something called a gambrel with a lean-to. Oh, there's just about every kind of example that you can think of. So here's the gambrel roof, the English gambrel mostly, with an attached lean-tos on the side, one side, or this crazy example here in Mount Vernon that's got a lean-to on both sides. As you notice on the left, it's got a gambrel lean-to and then a shed lean-to on the other side. And there's kind of a funny story behind why that is. And I won't tell you because it's one of the survey, I think it's one of the featured barns of the week, actually. Is that right, Jay? Gives you kind of the story behind that.
That's top secret, Michael.
Top secret. Okay, I won't tell you then. I won't tell you. So the gambrel with the lean-to. Other examples that you might find out there with a single lean-to or double lean-to as well. There are barns that have a hip roof, although there's not many in the state, and I don't really know the reason why. Certainly almost even don't look like barns when you look at them. This one down in Vancouver that's made out of brick is really more of a carriage shed than a full-blown, kind of agricultural barn. So just house horses and a blacksmith shop on the first floor, things like that. One up in Coupeville and Moxie are probably the best examples that we have with a hip or pyramidal shape roof. Then you have the Gothic Arch. This is just what it is. The shape of the roof looks like a Gothic point of a Gothic roof of a cathedral. And they have to come up to a point up at the top. And sometimes they might have a little flare down at the eave line. Maybe it's a smooth flare, or maybe it's more of a rigid flare to them. And again, these can be all different sort of shapes and sizes, depending on how wide those barns are. This one down in Vancouver that's got some gambrel dormers on it. Kind of an unusual example there. Here's some that have a shed attached to them. Again, sort of stylistic features you're kind of seeing on these barns. So this one up in Colfax, you can see these little knee braces in the gable ends, which are in the Gothic Arch end, which is indicative of the sort of the era of its construction, 1918, and that kind of that craftsman or arts and crafts feel to it. So another great example. But you also have barns that have a completely round or a bow truss roof to them. They don't come to a point in the middle. And these we call bow barns or round truss barns or rainbow truss barns. Sorry about that one in Covington. I'm not sure what's happening to that photo. You'll see a few of these around, not overly common, but you will find these around. The most typical one that you think you'd find in the West is the Western barn, or the monitor barn, if we talk about the roof line, where it has the center piece that is isolated from the two side aisles or two side wings. And it's got kind of a drop there. Some examples might have the windows, like the one up you see in Ellensburg. It's got the windows up there and the main gable before it drops down to the side aisles with those attached. So this isn't a gable with an attached lean-tos. This is a true Western barn, originally designed like this, with this building form. Other examples that you might find. This one up at Stanwood is kind of a crazy one. It's actually a hog barn, and it's over 100 feet long as well. So these tend to be pretty darn big structures generally, although the one up in Thurston County is quite small. Favorite one of everyone is round barns, right? Eccentric barns, round barns. If you go with my whole typology and roof form, you got to call them conical barns because it's the roof, right? These really are round barns, although they're not, most of the time, they're not completely round. They're usually octagonal or hexagonal, maybe 8 sides or 12 sides. And Washington State has a surprising number of these, probably a dozen or so, small and big, and certainly old and new, like this one in Gig Harbor from the 1950s. A couple other examples of these barns. These round barns, or the eccentric barns, a lot of them have a central grain silo in the middle. reason for this design really is about efficiency of farming and feeding the animals. So if you're walking around in a circle inside your barn, it's a lot easier than to be walking down and back through a big aisle, a long aisle. So it's about efficiency. And there was even a movement actually in the 1850s, 1860s back in the East Coast about round houses as well, or octagon houses, again, about the efficiency of living. That never really caught on here in the West. But you'll find, like I said, about a dozen of these across the state in different sizes and different build dates, although they really range from, I would say about 1908 to the late teens. None found any later than that. So where do all these designs come from? Kind of been wondering that myself, and really they could come from a variety of places. They could come from a farmer, an itinerant builder. They might actually be architect designed. They might come from a plan service, an extension office, a lumber yard. They might even be a kit that you could get from somewhere else. And here's some examples of kit barns. And so you could order a kit basically from a catalog. So you would go to Sears and Roebuck. You pick out, I'll take barn number 25. It would come pre-cut, labeled, and then it would get shipped to your farm, and you just put it together like an erector set. And so that was definitely a thing. There are some Sears barns in Washington State. There was another competing manufacturing company down in Portland, and we know some of these Fenner ready-cut barns are found here in Washington State. I know there's one in Colfax area. Montgomery Ward's also had a ready-cut. Aladdin Homes, there are lots, probably a good dozen different companies that offer these barns. So there's certainly the possibility of kit barns out there. The extension service also played a big role, in particular in the teens and the 20s, but even all the way up to the 30s. And of course, they play a big role in ag today. But the extension service in and of itself really came into existence to push the science of them being more efficient with their processing of crops and horses and things like that. And so the Smith-Lever Act of 1914 is what established extension services all across the U.S. actually. And both WSU and OSU Extension, Oregon State University Extension, they offered these kind of free plan service where you could go in and get a free plan from them to construct your barn. And we know some examples of barns that are constructed of those designs as well. Probably the more typical situation might be barns that were constructed via planned services or via lumber yards. And so the goal here would be is that you could go into the local lumber yard, get a free plan, and they were hoping that you would buy all the lumber for the barn right there at the local lumber store. And so there are examples of those. This is a little spec sheet from one down in Astoria up in the upper right of a barn that's built down in Grays Harbor County from Astoria Lumber. And I think the total cost was somewhere around, $35 in 1908, which I suppose is a lot of money in 1908. But, Weyerhaeuser, Tumulon Lumber Company outside of Walla Walla, most big local lumber companies had a little free plan service or plan book on them. We've looked at the outsides. Now I really want to just sort of get a peek at the inside of these structures and look at how they're constructed. And you'll be surprising at the variation of barn construction out there. One of the companies or organizations that were pushing, different technologies of barn trusses in the 20th century was the American Society of Agricultural Engineers. They were a specific sort of group that focused in on ag design in the early 20th century. Here's just a graph of some of these barn truss types. And we have some of these types in the States, and I'll show you a couple of them. But before we look at those, we got to look at log barns. They really might be the earliest log structures that you might find out there on the landscape. And log structures in general are classified by not only what kind of logs they are, whether the logs are round, but also if the logs are hewn, whether they're squared, And then you have to look at the type of notching, sort of the connections at the corners on how they're put together, whether it's a saddle notch or a dovetail notch or a V notch, things like that. We also have an unusual example, one down in the bottom middle that's got vertical logs instead of horizontal logs. That's a little later barn from the 1930s. Most barns, that when people think of barns, they think of this heavy timber framing construction that is put together with, well, back in the day, back on the East Coast, it might be hand-hewn timbers. Here in Washington State, they're still really milled timbers coming out of a local mill, but they're put together with pegs and mortise and tenon, little things that slide in with each other. And so those are easy to kind of spot once you get into the inside. And you'll know if you see one of those that it's going to be one of the earliest barns out there on the landscape. And these can date from anywhere from, you'll find heavy timber framing all the way up into the teens, really, early teens anyways in Washington State. Because farmers were, they're kind of slow to new technologies and moving. They do what they're tried and true. This is the method I know, and this is how I'm going to get it built. So you'll find some of those things. What you often find, though, is pole construction. So instead of having hewn timbers here in Washington State, the Pacific Northwest, you'll see just barns made out of round logs. Round poles, if you will. So they didn't take the extra time to square those off, or maybe they couldn't find timbers that were big enough. And so a lot of these kind of seem to defy gravity, like this crazy roof structure that you see here on the far right-hand side. No posts, just kind of this freestanding roof space. What's more typical is plank framing construction. So this is more the typical construction that you might find in a house that are built out of dimensional lumber, 2x4s, 4x4s, 4x6s, traditional building materials found on plank structures. And when you look at these plank structures and plank timbering details, they're kind of all over the place in terms of how they're sort of detailed out and how they're put together. And one of the ones that's interesting to look at is the Gambrel roof. And there's different types of plank framing or truss systems that are found inside that roof, holding up that unusual shape. And if you start to look at the details inside, there's ones called the braced frame, which has elements that go from, you can kind of see here in this picture in the middle, from the top of the hayloft to halfway up the break, and they kind of connect these different pieces as they go up over that element of the roof. Here's one that's called a Iowa or a Clyde truss frame. This has got a structural element that goes all the way from the eave line up to the very tip top of the peak of that Gambrel roof. And then to hold it together, it's got this diagonal piece that comes down. That's called an Iowa or Clyde truss. Who knew there were different types? There's even something called a Chaver truss. Too many details, Michael. Never remember all these. I never remember all these, but if you got a little guidebook, it's fun to sort of look at those details. So this is kind of a cross member in between that comes up all the way from the floor to the break, and then from the eave line to the roof. So that's a Chaver truss system. There are other truss systems which I have yet to identify what their names are, but if any of you know them, I would love to know. Just some examples of, again, some different framing techniques of these Gambrel roof barns. What about the Gothic roof shape? I would have thought that they were all the same sort of truss system, but there are not. There are some that actually have like a truss that's angled. There are others that look like a glulam beam that come in. And then there are others that are plank or sawn rafters that have these short little, maybe 2 foot long sections that are put together continuously to make that roof shape. So different sort of designs can happen with them as well. Build these things, typically the trusses are built on the ground flat, and then they are pushed up or raised up to the top and make that sort of system, and then they get all interconnected together. So that's the Gothic arch. You're also going to find some great concrete barns out there, although not as many as you might think. Concrete, is a technology that really shows up in the late O's, early teens. And there's different kinds of concrete, all the way from concrete block to poured concrete. The idea behind pushing concrete in barn construction is the cleanliness of barns in particular, and the longevity of those structures. So you can kind of keep those standing for longer. You also might find out there, although pretty rare, are brick barns or brick silos or clay tile silos. Not used very much in Washington State, and I'm not sure the reason for that. Probably because wood is plentiful. No need to go to a brick material, but you'll find them out there. As we sort of progress preservation field-wise, into the 21st century, we start to think about post-World War II designs and bridges and barns and structural systems and how those things are put together. And of course, you have to talk about plywood because plywood shows up on the landscape, early on, but in the O's, in '05 shows up actually. But in truss systems starts to show up really in the post-war period after the late 1940s, early 1950s. So you might find some barns that are like this. And we have some barns from the 50s and 60s that are actually designated on the barn register as well. I'm getting close to being done here, Jay. When you look at barns, another fun thing to look at is just the details of the barn. And there's always the hay hoods, which are easy to spot, and it's surprising how many different designs there are. The whole idea behind the hay hood is to protect this hay fork, or called a Jackson fork, which would come out and grab with this arm the hay that's on the ground and then pulled up to the inside. And so the hay hood is just covering this bar that comes out. And the bar typically is wood, although it might be metal in later cases. And you'll see different designs. Why is this one enclosed? Down here on the bottom right-hand side, because when you've got a mound of hay and you're trying to get it ready to put up in the hayloft, it gets very windy if you're over on the east side of the mountains. And so that just kind of stabilizes it from the wind, is why it's enclosed there. And so you'll see lots of other designs. You'll see some that don't even have a hay hood, like this one down in Whitman County. It just has that track coming out for that hayloft. The one up in Spokane has a more integrated hayloft with the structure itself because it sticks way out there. So those are kind of fun to look at. You also have to think about ventilation in barns too. And there are lots of different barns with different types of ventilation, whether it's something from a metal picked out of a catalog that's really a ventilator rather than a cupola. Most of these have, or some of them might have a weather vane. You could order these weather vanes from catalogs. You could order these ventilators from catalogs. I just threw in a spec sheet from a catalog there of all the different designs that you could get, from a cow to a horse to a waterfowl to a guy golfing, whatever shoots your fancy, I guess, on top of your barns. But those cupolas design also range greatly, really at the fancy of the farmer, how elaborate they wanted to get. So those are fun to look at. We also need to think about the inside of the barns and what might be still left on the inside, those remnant features, whether it's original tack that's left inside, to stanchions, to things that help the farmer process or move, whether it's manure or grain around the barn. Here's some watering troughs from the Jamesway Company, things of that nature. So when we have those original things left in the barn, those are pretty special because they often get torn out and replaced, and as barn uses change and technology changes. It's also fun to look at some of the stylistic or decoration details inside of barns, or maybe even the outside of a barn, ancient graffiti, if you will. I always love these. This is the Heath farm that's got a little family history of the cow or the sire, I guess, if you will, and who their offspring is up there. The one on Evie's Road Farm is an early, like a shopping list, so to speak. And then you have some other crazy ones, that are truly graffiti with this boat carved from 1936. And yeah, I mentioned show you this picture of this barn in Polson outside of Waterville. There are two of these barns like this that have this Dr. Pierce's tonic painted on the outside, so you could use your barn for advertising early on. And it was a great way to have the farmers, supplement their income. So there's two of those that I know in Washington. The other one's down by outside of Centralia, Chehalis area. And it's also important to kind of think about what else is on the farm itself. While the focus is always on the barn itself, there's other cool structures out there, whether it's the silo or windmills, which are quickly disappearing, to outhouses, which are also quickly disappearing, and things like chicken sheds and water towers and things like that. Smokehouses, also fun to look at. You might find some wood sheds, houses, granaries, the farmhouse itself, maybe the original Homestead Cabinet is there. Oftentimes, the barns were built first because that's the important structure to try and make some money. And then you build yourself a typical, small little wooden log cabin before you focused on, or maybe before you even had enough money to build a big farmhouse for your growing family. So to have those original structures is pretty special to find as well. That reaches the end of my show. I know there's probably some questions out there.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I'm just popping back in here to help manage the Q&A section. Mm-hmm. So yes, we have comments coming in saying excellent presentation, completely agree. It never gets old, even though I've seen a lot of these pictures before. Our state really has some beautiful, beautiful barns, and it's wonderful that Michael's office, the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, is managing the register and is able to get such a good sense of what's out there. We have a question about the final slide, what that location was, Michael.
Oh, that was in Walla Walla. That's the site's barn. There's actually two octagon or round barns on that site. And they are recently one of our grant award recipients, actually. So they got some money to rehab the barn, and we'll be talking about that later in the week. Maybe tomorrow, right? I think tomorrow. Yes, there you go.
They'll be featured, one of our feature projects tomorrow, and we had a great pun in the chat box. Thank you for your puns. We love them. We also did have a question, Michael. Pretty broad question, so I'm not sure if there's really an answer, but someone asked basically how many barns we think were in Washington historically, and roughly how many we think we have today. So I know we have 792 on the register currently, but that certainly doesn't encompass all Washington barns.
Yeah.
But what would you say to that question?
Well, I guess the only real quantifier that we have was a census from 2000, I think it was from 2000 actually, that one of the census questions out there was, do you have a historic barn on your property that was built pre-1960? And the answer came back for Washington that there was over 9,000 barns pre-1960. So we're basically scratching the surface. I don't know how many of those are left now, 20 years later. My sense is they're coming down pretty fast, but we certainly have more than 800 that we know of. Yeah.
Which I mean is one of the big reasons that that the grant program was established, was because a lot of barns are changing uses or not useful like they used to be, and so the grant program is intended to help preserve those historic structures. So we also had a question early on, Michael, about your catalogs and where you find all the catalog photos that you're able to use in your presentation.
I can't give all my secrets away, can I? I've been collecting these things sort of over the years, but the good news is that I posted a lot of them on our website. So if you go to our barn page on our website under technical barns, there's probably, well, I don't know, probably 50 different kind of catalogs of barn related stuff on there, whether it's silos to technologies to catalogs. So those are, use them. That's why they're out there. I love to share data and information.
Great. We have a question about what is the most common barn type in Washington?
Good question. You know, I think if we looked at this, the 800 that are designated, the most popular one is really the broken gable design. There's a lot of those out there. Not overwhelmingly, but the second one would be the Gambrel design. And, you know, both of those are really going to stem from the built dates of construction. So lots of barns built in the teens and the 20s. And that's kind of when that style would have been popular, I guess, if you will.
Awesome. Well, we have another question. We have someone who's saying they have 2 granaries on their property, and they're asking how they go about finding how old they are if their farm records don't identify them. Is there any way to do additional research?
Ooh, that's a good question. Ask your neighbors. That's always a good one. You know, it's tough to date structures. Sometimes you can tell from the technology of the construction itself, whether, you know, how it's jointed together, what kind of nails it might be. You might also, there are some old maps that are out there that I've got some links on our website that might also point out a barn. You might also find, if you haven't done like a full title search, sometimes those things come up in a title search, whether the value of the property increases because there was something that was built on the property. So that's another way to sort of decipher a built date, but it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, I get that question too. And I literally say, ask your neighbors, try to find photographs with dates on them. It's a lot of these structures don't have very good records, unfortunately, especially the smaller ones.
Yeah.
All right, we have a question about the register, which I could certainly chime in on, but since you are the keeper of the register, it says, can I add structures to a barn's listing, or do they get a separate designation like the root cellar? And what if we moved a structure like the spring house or a granary? Can it be added to a listing?
Well, let's talk about the first one. It's when you submit a barn register nomination, the second page is what else is on the site. So we should have a record, if you filled it out correctly, of what else is on site. So if there's a cellar on there, that should be spelled out. I think for the barn grant program, all those secondary structures, except for the house, if it's ag related, would be eligible to apply for the grant program. If something is moved, it gets a little bit dicey. We certainly don't like to see things moved, but we do have some barns that are moved that are on the barn register as well, you know, as a last step scenario. So that's a possibility. It's a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And I mean, a lot of the barn grant funds go toward the larger structures because that's the priority of the program is to preserve the large structure. But if people were to apply for a grant for other smaller structures as part of a whole project, they would certainly are eligible. And I think if it were part of a larger project, that would be a better angle for potential funding. So
be a little more competitive that way, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I saw a couple of questions about the census pop up. I'm gonna ask my my coworker Alex to let me know if there's another
Jay, I
question
see
about
not
the
your
census
friend.
that came through.
No, there's not. They were asked and answered in the chat box, it looks like.
Great.
Okay, great. So I think we are getting toward the end of the hour. We're trying to keep this under an hour just so people can finish up their lunches and get back to their work day. So we'll end with I think a great question. It might be hard, or maybe Michael is going to plead the fifth on this one, but someone asked what your favorite barn in Washington is.
Oh boy.
I'm sure you get this all the time.
I do get it all the time. You know, I don't actually have a favorite. I really don't. Because each one is so unique and tells this great story, and I love to hear about the stories. So keep them coming.
Not even like a top 5. You want to give us a little? But that was very diplomatic.
You gotta love round barns, right? I mean, the round barns are the ones that are amazing construction. So
yes,
any of those, dozen round barns that we have would be on my top list.
Yes, we are, one of our featured barns of the day is a round barn this week. And then as we mentioned, tomorrow we'll be featuring the Zeitz barns, which are octagonal, but still centric barns. And they're very, very cool. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you everyone for joining. This was a really awesome presentation, and especially thank you to Michael Hauser at the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation for giving this presentation. We hope everyone enjoyed it. As we said, tomorrow, Chris Moore, our Executive Director, and I will be highlighting grant projects from the past 13 years of the grant program. So tune in for that. Don't forget, you do have to register separately for it. But it is at the same time, same format tomorrow on Zoom, just a different registration link. So go to preservoir.org/barn week to see the whole list of events if you don't have any of our emails handy. And then of course, in the meantime, don't forget to head to Facebook, Instagram, tag us at Preservoir, tag us at #BarnWeek. Check out the additional trivia and featured barns that we're doing there, and comment on them and have fun guessing those trivia questions. There are Barnogram prizes for those who guess correctly. We have a bunch to share with those who guess our trivia correctly. Did you have a comment, Michael?
Oh, I was going to say, exciting, the barnograms. Yes, they're awesome.
They are fun. So
thank you, Harrison. Yes.
Who is featured on Thursday. So of course, don't forget to tune in on Thursday for a masterclass from Harrison Goodall. And if you haven't done so already and want to stay on top of all things barns in Washington State, we do have an email list, and you can go to our website, preservoir.org/barnweek, to find the link to that, or in the chat. I know we're putting those links there as well. You'll get notifications about salvage materials, barn grants, fun other content, features and articles that we put in our magazine, things like that. And finally, if you enjoyed today's program and are not already involved with the Washington Trust, please do become a member. We're a nonprofit membership organization. In addition to Barn Week and the Heritage Barn Grant Program, which is a partnership with DAP, we do a wide range of other opportunities to get involved in preservation in Washington State, including advocacy, networking, education, and other virtual events like this one, which we're trying to get a little bit more creative about lately with how things are. And you can join as a member at preservoir.org/member. And I know we'll throw that link in the chat box as well. And thanks again, finally, to everyone. And we'll see you tomorrow at noon for barn rehabs and restorations with me and Chris. Don't forget to register for the other event, and we'll see you tomorrow right back here.
So much, Jay. And for all of you out there, if you got a question about your barn, send me a photo.
We have a lot of emails back and forth about barns, you and I.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
All right, and we'll send out to the participants. We can send out a copy of Hauser's slides, because I know some people were saying it was going viral fast. They wanted to look at the pictures more. I responded in the chat and I was like, he can't slow down. Sorry. I told him to go fast.
I skipped over a lot of stuff, but because it was only about 40 minutes, I've been strained.
Yes. And we'll include some links to the catalogs and other information too. We can send out a little follow-up email for this session specifically to everyone. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Oh, we're getting a request for a 2-hour presentation next time, Hauser, so we'll keep that in mind. Okay, we're going to sign off. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Enjoy your afternoon. Bye-bye.